and welcome to this episode 172 of Frame and Reference. You're about to drop in on a conversation between me, Kenny McMillan, and my guest Jomo Fray, DP of Nickel Boys. Enjoy. It just sucks that Panavision has like a death grip on great tech, you know, because like I was just talking to Sal Totino yesterday. That's where I went after I saw you. I was like, I gotta go. I had to come. I live on the west side, so I had to drive all the way back.
Oh wow.
But we were talking about these new Chinese lenses that have been coming out everywhere, and like Laowa sent me these anamorphics.
Yeah.
And they're
really want to test them.
Oh, you can borrow. I mean, I've got these now, so
oh my god,
feel free. But the thing that I've noticed about them, and like it seems to be a lot of these new modern lenses, is like these are perfect in the sense that, you know, yes, it's anamorphic. You can see that, but there's just no real character to it. And in the same way that like those Sigma primes are really nice for
totally,
you know, when you need like that really sharp. Like I don't think Sigmas are clinical. I don't really.
Yeah.
Clinical feels. I mean, I've looked in a microscope. That's clinical.
Yeah,
you know,
totally.
There's no sensibility to it.
Totally.
But these are very like sharp, clean anamorphics, which could certainly be. I'm about to shoot a documentary with these, but it's for an NBA player, so it's like it doesn't need to be crazy, you know.
Yeah. Kind of. That's what I want to really use them to see what would happen if they got detuned, or putting them with something like a 416 and making film kind of do the image degradation. So then it's like, okay, there's sharpness actually is like what you kind of want, but you're doing cellular, and then kind of pushing or pulling or like bringing some funk into the emulsion. And they're small size. Yeah. I kind of want, like, you know, there's always with the 416, or if you're shooting on 16, like trying to not make it kind of turn into 35 with like all the things you're adding on to it. So
yeah, I mean,
I'm curious.
That was the big thing about that I found funny with like new people getting into film, was them bemoaning how clean lenses are. And I was like, you guys have no idea that like Nikon was seen as the king of all lenses because they could resolve something onto film.
Totally. Oh,
FDs were seen as kind of me.
Yeah, totally. I know. It's genuinely, sometimes I'm like, man, it would be really amazing, and also probably very tough to start cinematography now, because there are just so many genuinely powerful cameras, like prosumer cameras with variable ND filters, like crazy things to me, where it's like, yes, that would have been amazing to pay like $3,000 for a camera with that wide a dynamic range and with that many kind of pro level tools, so you could scale up production wise. But also I'm sure it becomes very, very difficult then for a lot of young people to kind of like break through the noise, because everyone kind of has now like heavy tier tools, like again for like a few $1,000s. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I was just talking to Dan Keynes right before you got on about he has like a, I think it was his, maybe he was just promoting someone else, but like an OG red Mysterium or MX, whatever, the first one. You had the first one.
Yeah, the red one.
Yeah, and I was like, I have an XL2. If you want to go real vintage about it.
Totally.
And I remember my like grandparents had left me like a few bonds that I cashed in or something, and for $5,000 as a teenager, I bought an XL2.
Yeah.
And there are certain things on that camera that to this day I'm surprised don't make it into modern cameras that cost more. The lenses had built-in NDs, actually.
Yeah.
You know, global shutter, whatever. Technically mirrorless. And just the amount, how crappy that camera is in comparison to just even a cell phone, but like, you know, for the same price, it's crazy.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I feel like XL2 is one of the great cameras of its time. I used to love that. I also like, I remember like working a bunch of summer jobs to like save up to buy an XL2, and like right as I did, the like first high definition camera came out, and it was like, yeah, it like came to me very quickly. But the camera is incredible. Great camera.
Yeah. I agree with you though. I think nowadays trying to get into filmmaking, I think because you can start so hot, like just pulling any camera out and just filming something. I feel like you stop asking the right questions, and by that I mean,
Hmm.
why doesn't mine look like film?
Totally.
When you weren't shooting film, there was a lot of other questions to ask. Is my lighting good? Is my
Totally.
production design good?
Totally
Whatever.
agree.
Now that you have the camera, it's like something is wrong. It's got to be someone else's fault, or I don't know.
No, no, I totally feel you. I feel like it's like, I almost think about, I feel really fortunate to kind of have almost like grown up on like reversal
Mm.
and then like early digital cameras where they just had no dynamic range. So they're basically digital reversal, where it's like, oh, you just have to know ratios. If you want something to look expanded, it's like really needing to light meter it even with a digital camera because it's gonna clip in like a stop and a half, where I feel like I totally hear you with the difficulty of having so many of those tools when you first start is now that it's like, it would be really easy to skip over things like exposure diversity and lighting if your camera just has an intense amount of dynamic range. It's like, okay, then how are you going to know where to place your values? How would you learn the zone system if you just kind of never needed to, which I do think still helps the process of learning all of those basics really slowly. I feel like allows you to then really dynamically break the rules.
Yeah, I've actually got Ansel Adams print right there. I got from the
Mm.
post office.
Oh, wow.
The post
That's
office had a
amazing.
whole Ansel Adams series where those are stamps, and then they had like field notes
Whoa.
books.
Oh my
Um,
God, that's awesome.
but yeah, I got the print, the negative, in the camera. I think those like film is not that old.
No.
It's 120 years, something like that. Like
Yes,
the
it's young.
lessons, it hasn't changed. The art form hasn't changed in the way that you know music has, for instance. Like instruments
Hmm.
becoming digital and being able to be that
Hmm.
expressive, I think, is a different animal than film becoming digital.
Hmm. I
Like the
agree.
capture method is different, but the fundamentals are still the same. Well,
Yeah,
I guess it's the same overall.
well, I think that it's still, I think film has only begun to scratch the surface of what it's truly capable of. It's like I'm reminded of painting in the sense that for a long time, the highest form of painting was photorealism. And so it was like, and that was the only thing they had access to. So it's like you see it in the portraits of royals and monarchs, where it's like these things are trying to capture an impossible to capture world. And then photography comes in, and then people are bemoaning the possibility that the painting will now go away completely. It'll have no purpose because a single photo, a daguerreotype photo, is more accurate than the best photorealistic painting. But I think that it's actually in that moment that painting kind of unlocked itself, because then it was like, okay, well, if we don't need to try to be photorealistic, then why don't we be emotionally realistic? And then you find expressionism, and then all of these things I feel like as this explosion. I think cinema is still in that space of thinking about photorealism. And I don't think it's quite clicked into that next mode yet, where it's actually like, we have moments of that German expressionism. There are different things in filmmaking that have like kind of had that energy. I think black and white, because it was black and white, also had that aspect to it that it was always already metaphoric. But like, I'm excited for film to cross the threshold into that next space where it's like, actually we can just take it as a medium that's fully just our dreams and we can just run with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the I'm often reminded of the David Fincher quote of like it's more about what you don't do. When you can do
Totally.
anything, like what you don't do kind of um describes what your thing is supposed to be. And you're
Absolutely.
so right. Like I people are getting back into different formats, like we were saying DV or whatever, black and
Hmm.
white, for instance. I just
Hmm.
saw Nosferatu,
Yeah,
that saying it's, not quite 4:3, but the black and white looks great. It's
yeah,
not black and white. It's just very desaturated in a lot of
very
things.
decent. Yeah,
But but I just love the idea that like now I'm with you. I think like now you can just do it. It doesn't have to be a genre anymore. Now you can just
yeah,
use whatever you want to make whatever you want. It doesn't have to be, oh, you shot black and white, therefore it's a noir or whatever.
totally. No, I think that that's the exciting thing about art. I feel like and also the tie to technology is when you have a technological option that actually invalidates the option before it, then the option before actually now becomes a choice. It doesn't just become the default mode of capture. Like, we see this in cinematography when people were shooting 35 and 16 was a budget alternative. The moment digital comes into the picture, and the moment digital is like kind of embraced, all of a sudden 35 millimeter or 16 become an artistic choice. They aren't, because before that moment they were the default mode of capture. There wasn't an alternative. So that's what you did. And I think that same thing with standard definition, same thing with mini DV. That was the best that we could do for pro super cameras at that time. And then all of a sudden, as soon as you change over, same with CMOS to CCD sensors, it's like all of a sudden CCD sensors have something special to them precisely because CMOS sensors make more sense.
Yeah.
But I think that that's kind of the exciting thing about all art is that every piece of the machine can become an artistic choice once technology has kind of moving past what's the best way and the industry standard. Then every deviation of standard kind of becomes something you could creatively kind of tweak and mess with.
Well,
Yeah,
and something that I just realized is like, because I was gonna say like, well, then how do you, a lot of productions are applauded for not using VFX or shooting on film because the audience, the vocal portion of the audience, seems to think that those things are quote unquote better. And I'm realizing now when you're talking about industry standard is like I blame the internet for a lot of things, but I think one of them is because everyone is so privy to how films are, how the sausage is
totally.
made, so to speak, in many art forms, that they then have an opinion that they think is educated, and then whoever
Mhm,
is slightly more influential than anyone else sets the tone. No one's listening to the
mhm,
experts; they're listening to
mhm.
the critics.
Totally. Totally.
Um, and yeah, that just lightning bolted me in the head. Now I'm like, oh shit, how do you convince these people like, no, you're not the expert, and that's fine. Let us
Yeah.
discuss. Not us,
Well,
like I'm there too, but
yeah, yeah. But no, I think that that's kind of I, that's why I think that it's like when I think about just like critics or internet critics or any of those things, like that is a super important job. And that's an important job because it helps curate for film watchers what films they should watch. And I think that, same with like internet pundits, it's like that serves a purpose in kind of like curating the experience of moving through it. But ultimately, as artists, as people making cinema, it's like, I feel like I don't know how useful that can always be towards like what artistically you should be doing or whether the choice you made was good or bad. Like, it's one of those things where I try to separate myself from that idea where it's just like, I try to make a strong choice and a person can either like or dislike that choice. That is absolutely their prerogative. But I can never be accused of not making a choice. It was always a choice. But yeah, I think that there's sometimes a little conflation right now because there's so many voices in the kitchen of the difference between not liking a choice and thinking it was wrong.
right.
And I think that it's like one of those things where we need to give artists who are at the level of their craft that they're working the respect to think that something that's happening is a true. You could not like that this episode of Game of Thrones is too dark. That's totally fine. But it isn't that, you know, these men and women don't know what they're doing. It's like they know what they're doing. They're just making a choice that you do not resonate with. And that is fine. But the same way of going into, and looking at a painting and being like, Pasta's using too much blue. He should have been using green. He messed it up, picking the wrong pigment. It's like, no, it's blue, and that's what he's going for. And although you can not like that choice, that's totally valid.
Well, and I think too, because image making on the photographic or the video side of things is so accessible that people again think that they have, like, I don't think anyone looks at a painting and immediately thinks, oh, they should have done this, because they can't paint. The average
Yeah.
person can't paint. The average person can pick up a camera, which is beautiful for the art form because that means more voices can,
Mhm. Totally.
participate. But at the same time, if you're not interested in participating in earnest, I don't want to hear from you. Like,
I think that's fair.
it's just, for instance, and the other thing, actually, to your point about Game of Thrones, like a lot of people were just let down by either their TV, their viewing environment, or their internet speed.
Totally.
And you
Totally.
can't hold the filmmakers accountable for you having 15 megabit down internet, and watching
Totally.
with a big reflection on your TV.
Totally. No, completely. I think that that's like so much of the hardship of kind of, being a cinematographer in a modern era is understanding there's so many different viewing environments. And at some very real level, you can't necessarily count for all of those. And the ideal hope is that a transference of an idea still takes place. Even though it's like, for a movie like Nickel Boys as well, it's like, we go into a theater to look at our camera test because scale is an important aspect of that image. But also it's like, well, like actually not everyone can afford or has the time or the interest to integrate scale into the image. And that just becomes part of it, which again, I like to try to divorce myself on feeling like there's one way to watch it. And if someone isn't watching that way, they're not getting the story. I would like to hope that, it's something always comes out in however a person interacts with any piece of media. Like I feel it for new parents when, I'll talk to filmmakers who have just had kids and they'll apologize. Oh, I had to watch the movie in three chunks. And it's like, sure, of course, we would be designed it for watching it in one chunk, but I don't know if the options was watching it in three chunks and not watching it at all. Oh my God, I'm just so happy that you watched it at all.
Right.
Um, but it is a weird world of someone who's obsessed with images and then image rendition for there to be so few ways to kind of control that through the pipeline. So I feel like it has become kind of a meditative process of my own of just like kind of letting go of a bit of my own control. And that moment, the same way that you can't control if someone walks into your movie right after a breakup, if someone walks into your movie right after a death, like that is going to color their experience for good or for ill. And it's kind of impossible to control some of those things. And unfortunately, this image rendition feels like it's a thing you can control, but we have not been able to. So, I
Yeah.
kind of let it go a little bit. Also, there have been so many movies where I saw bad prints or bad versions of the movie and like fell in love with some of the color on it, and then saw it later and was like, oh wow, that was a super hazed kind of like screen print that I
Just
saw.
ran
But
through print. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But it's like, oh man, I was loving kind of like the milky, silky quality of it, even though that's kind of wasn't the intention, which is just to say, images are inspired kind of no matter where they come from. So I kind of try to let it go a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, the two arguments I've heard are, and I kind of have waffled between them throughout the years, but like, do you make it for the highest possible quality? This is sort of the David Fincher's, well, I guess not Fincher, but certainly, what's his face? Tenet, Chris Nolan.
Mhm.
He's like, the only version of this you should care about is IMAX, Dolby, Atmos, or whatever. Everything else is secondary to that. And then the counter argument being, well, we don't have that. So what about us? And then that being the argument of, should you make your film to be watched on an iPad or whatever, so that if someone does see it in a theater, they're actually getting a worse experience, so to
Mhm.
speak. And it's kind of the that argument I've heard is kind of the same of like when you're mastering a record and you take it in the
Mhm.
car and whip it around.
Totally.
But I think you make it for my opinion is you make it the best you can, and then the car test is just to make sure that it doesn't fall apart, not that you're supposed to be
Yes.
mastering for the car.
Yes. I think that that's kind of how I think about it as well, where it's exactly that. You're not, and also like maybe I think that every image has a set of component parts that kind of inform how that image is working. And I think it's almost like, that's one of the dials. I think one of the dials onto creating an emotion in an image, one of them is scale. Of if the image is big or if it is small relative to the viewer. That does something. And I think that like a movie like Dunkirk, like
Mm.
seeing that at scale, I think is part of, or a movie like There Will Be Blood. I think that those are two movies that scale the largest, Lawrence of Arabia, third one of like the feeling of largeness versus your position as a viewer, I think is an important part of it. Like I remember one of the first times I watched 2001 Space Odyssey, sadly was on a small television. And I like watching it. I was like, this movie's okay. And then, many years later, I had an opportunity to watch a 70 mil print of it in a theater. And it was like, oh, now I get it in a different way of like the smallness as humans as we relate to a cosmic process.
And
This is part of that. And like actually without me having the scale of that difference of when the bone goes into the air and seeing the space station, that the bone is so small and the space station is so massive in size and scope. It's like, oh, me feeling small in the universe is actually part of what this movie is like trying to play at. So me not see like having that relationship actually does take an element out of it that I think I did kind of need for me, which again just means that that slider scale, I think for Kubrick was up, and Lawrence of Arabia, that slider scale was up. Like it's meant to feel small in the space of the environment, but not everything needs that. And for the projects that do need that, I think that it's about it's almost like again like painting. I would always encourage a painter to like paint to the canvas that makes sense for the work.
not an
Pollock needs a
Instagram
large
photo of
canvas.
it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like don't make it for how it'll be rendered and recaptured and disseminated. Make it for the canvas it's meant to be on. Pollock needed a big canvas. Salvador Dali needed a small canvas. Like that is just, and it is the same for all of their work, but it's piece to piece. I think is at least how I think about it. And I feel like I've always gotten confused when people kind of pose that same question of like, yeah, but how will people see it on an iPad? I don't know the same way they see anything on an iPad. I'm like, let's
Right.
make sure it doesn't look terrible on it. But if some of the concepts of the themes we're talking about involve scale as an important part of it, then like I don't know if it makes sense to necessarily build for something down the pipeline rather than for the ideal experience for that the movie's talking about, that the piece is talking about.
This is why I'm a big proponent of re-releasing old films now. I mean, obviously we had like the, dollar theaters or whatever, but I
Mm-hmm.
think that like doing these like AMC remaster, like I say we keep doing that. If theaters are worried about, people not coming, first of all, let's not leave movies in the theater for a week.
Mm-hmm. Totally,
The
totally agree.
movie being in the theater is part of the advertising strategy, in my
Totally
opinion.
agree.
Like, fucking get over it. Like, let it be there
Yeah,
for a month. And
yeah.
then two, re-release some of our old favorite films, like seeing 2001. But also, this makes me think of one of my first thoughts of watching Nickel Boys yesterday was, oh, I didn't know it was POV. I try to go, anytime I get a screener, I try to just not look anything up and just go in blind.
Yeah.
I did not know the whole film was POV. And so immediately my first thought, because again, I'm watching it analytically, unfortunately, because I had to ask you questions about it. But
Mm-hmm.
at a certain, I've learned that in the first 30 minutes, all my analytic questions are gone, and then I can just pay attention, which for this film is important. But panning speed,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
like to these questions of when you see like the screen we watched on yesterday, obviously wasn't terrifically big, but I imagine if you're seeing it in a AMC and not a new house, if you were to be whipping around, that might make
Mm-hmm.
the audience dizzy. Watching it on an iPad, you probably have more room to move quicker. So I was wondering what your
Yeah.
guys' is kind of I know you did a lot of thinking about how does a head move on a body and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that, but I was wondering if you could walk me through that.
Yeah. No, it really, it's a funny
And
thing
also
with this
lens
movie.
selection. Sorry.
Yeah, of course. No, of course. It's a funny thing with Nickel Boys because, even though the movie is point of view, which, even Ramel and I, when we started kind of talking about the movie, stopped kind of using that term and we started saying what we were looking for was a sentient image, was an image that felt connected to a body in a real present tense kind of way. And so it was less that we're focused on how does a person see, but what does it feel to see? How does it feel to see, and what does memory feel like? Which again was kind of this like a little bit of a balancing act there, where it's like we want it to be recognizable because when you're thinking about a sentient perspective, or when you're thinking about point of view, you're talking about kind of like the question of iPhones and iPhone photography. You're talking about a perspective that every single viewer is hyper literate in all of us have spent our entire lives within our own points of view, and we know intrinsically that when you look down, how you see how much of your chest you see, if you see your legs, like you just know those things at an intuitive level. So it became a funny thing with Nickel Boys of trying to create an image that, reflected the feeling of sight in that way. So then it became a situation where you were just always battling the uncanny. So like literally if something was like an inch to the left or an inch to the right, or moved too quickly or panned too fast, or the reaction was either too slow or too fast, genuinely sometimes the difference of a shot working or not could be a quarter of a second. Or it could be, the camera placed an inch below or an inch above a certain point. So it was one of those things where we like had to meticulously plan it and kind of like do a lot of camera testing. And ideally, the movie has a very almost lyrical, free flowing visual aesthetic to it. But the actual making of that thing was kind of a meticulous process of every single pan, tilt, or movement through space was pre planned with Ramel and I to hopefully try to pull you into a perspective that has an immersive quality to it, but which also kind of gets to the question of the lenses for the film, where again, we're trying to capture the feeling of sight. So then it was an interesting aspect of the film was kind of like asking ourselves to think about, well, what are certain times in your life and what do they look like and what do they feel like for us? And especially for some of the stuff in the early points of the movie with young Elwood, it was a funny thing we realized, oh, being young isn't just about being short or when you're thinking about perspective, it's actually that you are small relative to the size of everything else around you. So all of a sudden, like if a grandmother is like having a sheet above you, that sheet needs to feel like it can envelop the whole world. Like there is this adults need to almost feel like giants to you from that perspective. And there's a natural sense of wonderment to the world. You're seeing the world at that perspective as your relative size to everyone else. So kind of a big thing for us was when we ended up going with the Panavision VAs, because when I tested them, they had a sense of volume to them, which isn't the same necessarily as saying that they have a three-dimensional quality, but they have a sense of volume. Like I feel like you really, with those lenses, you feel relative space. You feel the foreground's real space and length distinction to the midground, to the background. And there was an aspect about that really felt like sight for Rebel and I, and it felt like you could really feel how big or how small a space was, which really became an important aspect for us. And also, doing things like shooting on telephoto lenses, shooting the entire movie in 4:3 was again to kind of create the feeling of selective focus in our brain. Like, of course, as humans, we have an incredibly wide field of view. But when we're looking at something, it isn't that that thing's in focus. Our eyes don't necessarily work like irises and optics, but it's that your brain is processing all the information and it is deciding to focus on this one piece of information. So you're perceiving it as it's in focus and everything else is kind of out of focus. So we were trying to mimic that sense of selective focus by using depth of field and using kind of telephoto lenses to ideally kind of bring you into the experience of just sharing time with these boys and not just being inside their bodies, but sharing their thought process of literally seeing them create meaning when it's going from one thing to another thing. Okay, what's the connection between the two things they saw? Okay, like that kind of informs inside of you a third idea, and then that third idea, it's like one of those things where I sometimes think about it, where it's like everyone knows that feeling when they're maybe in a sketchy situation. And if you sat down and told someone like why it felt uncomfortable, it would be a married of very small kind of perceptive subtext of like, they're kind of moving erratically, they're not making eye contact with me, their hand keeps going in their pocket. Like it's a lot of these like kind of small things that then you build together to form a sense of meaning of, oh, this space is dangerous for me. Um, uh, and I think that that's when we were thinking about Nickel Boys fundamentally, we were thinking about two young black boys kind of navigating the Jim Crow South, where quite literally where your gaze goes or where it doesn't go can mean the difference between life and death. So it's really ideally building that camera language to kind of pull you in to not just their sight, but their very thought processes they navigate their own space kind of with you concurrently.
Yeah. And one thing that I heard you mention in a different interview was it didn't even occur to me because it's shot so well, but fundamentally every shot is a oneer.
Yeah.
And it's like that's the one editing is the thing that tells the audience to take a breath. And so this entire film you're just kind of locked up. Even though at certain points you do cut between the two main POVs, but uh it does the like it, I didn't even necessarily internalize that it was all a oneer. I just felt that, which I think as you've described your cinematography's empathetic or experiential storytelling, that must have been a boon for you to do it quite literally in this film.
No, completely. It really felt like I've been thinking about a lot of these things. And like, there's a way in which sometimes I almost feel like I'm more influenced by like Uta Hagen and Stanislavski, like acting theory,
Mm.
than I am sometimes about photographic theory of like how actors are able to kind of maintain that kind of vulnerability. And I think that for my entire career, it's always been this thought of like, how do you transfer some of those thoughts that actors are kind of having philosophies for, and how do you channel that into the camera? How do you think about the camera not as a tool, but as an organ, as an extension of maybe your capacity for compassion, your capacity for empathy? But this project, as you're saying, kind of was such an incredible opportunity because it kind of made me have to put my money where my mouth is on that of like, no, 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 like it isn't just that you're trying to create a vulnerable connection through the camera. Like you truly have to be a scene partner now with the actor. It's like, in the scenes where when a character is hugging another character, that's me they're physically hugging. And that changes how you shoot an image. When literally there is just that physical haptic connection with another human being that in their mind is your grandmother and is truly hugging you deeply. And then when you're thinking about operating the camera and you're placing yourself in the headspace of their grandson, all of a sudden it isn't just Ingenue Ellis, the like revered actor. All of a sudden it's that embrace has a different tenor to it, a different quality. And I think that as an operator and also as a cinematographer, you end up needing to meet that emotion, which felt really special in, yeah, being able to kind of channel some of that through the camera in a more direct fashion than I've kind of been allowed to or asked to do for anything else in my career.
Yeah, because I'm glad you brought that up because I wrote down uh DP as actor because I know you guys used like the mimic, the headgear sort of camera
Mhm.
Scorpio head thing, as well as like shoulder mount and hand mount and whatever. But where are the other actor? Are they just standing right behind you or like on one side of the camera or for the other actor to kind of do that
Make
with or
that
like
connection.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, oftentimes it would be a lot of different configurations. I'd say most often, if it was handheld, truly they're almost cheek to cheek with you, where they were trying to get as tight as possible, either an eyeline, and usually it was less because of the eyeline and more because they wanted to be close to be able to touch, to hold, to interact with their other scene partner. But towards that, it was again being as close as possible to that center line so they can kind of be there for their other actor. Like there was never a single shot in the movie where the person whose perspective it wasn't also on set and wasn't also kind of delivering lines or wasn't also kind of doing the performance as close to camera as possible to still form those connections, which is kind of why we decided to do the approach as kind of all oneers, where we knew that looking into the camera, of course, invites a level of artifice for the actors, and so it became a real question for us of like, okay, well, what can we do at every aspect of the filmmaking process to try to, mitigate some of the artifice that we're introducing into their process as actors? So, a lot of the lighting was done with mirrors and with like very large broad sources being pushed in or lights built into the set so that we could, as few moments as possible have lights or stands on set. So the actors could, from action, could just run through the entire emotion, run through the entire scene and kind of just like stay in that. But, there were also circumstances where I would be dressed in the costume of the character so that I can look down to my own body and
Mm.
like might be doing handheld and having my hands up and having their hands underneath my armpits so that like if I look down their hand, like it really was trying to figure out bunch of different configurations, and some of them, would be more technologically created like you were already saying, where it's like, using a dolly and under slinging a remote camera head and doing it in mimic mode. So I can be in another room and basically doing handheld look at my own body and seeing the actor's body in the shot. But also things where it was actually just about thinking really simply of like, okay, well, what's the simplest, almost stupidest way to do this thing? Sometimes we're the best options where again it's like, okay, well, why don't you put your arms underneath my arms while I'm like looking down and like we see our hands, or but there are also moments where there's some underwater sequences, and for that it was like an underwater operator like operating, and then the actor with kind of like a breathing apparatus who would be sitting off to the side and then would push in and then converge with the camera as like their hand would be entering the shot. So, it's a funny thing where I think that a lot of the images of this movie ideally have again that kind of like freewheeling feel to them, but oftentimes were incredibly orchestrated and would be like 5 or 6 people on walkie and on headset, kind of like cueing in different things to happen to make that feel natural. Because again, like truly, if there's any small thing that was off, it just felt uncanny. It just felt
Right.
wrong. And like everyone could feel it on set. Like the PA could look at the monitor and that feels weird. And again, that was kind of the hard part about this, where it's like some of those things weren't bad things. They just didn't make sense. Like one
Broke
example is
immersion.
there's a moment in a bus where our character Elwood looks down at a young girl like crawling between the seats, and he looks down under the chair to see her. And it's like the funny things you start recognizing where it's like, oh, the head is a really heavy. So like when it comes off of its center of gravity, it actually falls really fast. And then your muscles kind of tighten and you start controlling it. So then, for that shot, as we're like booming down on the dolly, it's like the the dolly operator actually needs to do it slowly and then do it fast and then kind of soften again in the way that feels natural to the neck, which actually isn't about making a clean operation. It's actually making kind of what would be not a great boom down for a dolly, but like it has to kind of be perfect at doing exactly that feeling of like, okay, when the muscles would retighten and you would slow down a little bit. So again, it's like kind of cueing everyone. And the focus like, when does the focus naturally go into the distance, was kind of always navigating, feeling these things that when the shot was working, it feels simple and it feels obvious. And if any aspect of the shot isn't working, it's really hard to figure out, well, what's not exactly working? And like, let's sit on this bench and let's just look underneath the chair and like, what are we noticing about our bodies moving through space that feels like? And again, it's about conjuring the feeling of sight. So like, there's some wiggle room, but we're just really perceptive. We're really
Yeah.
perceptive.
I'm just imagining you and like the director and the camera operator all off under a tent, just doing this a lot and trying to, yeah, just what
Totally.
feels right, It-
Totally. But that was like a lot of the shot listing. Ramel and I would have a small DSLR and we would literally like, we were meticulous in building the shot list together. And we would spend hours and hours and hours talking about it because we also had this DSLR and we're like, okay, let's do a hug. And it's like, okay, that doesn't feel right. It's like, maybe if you come from up and come down, it's like, okay, that feels better. But now it's like, okay, let's come up from down and let's rack out to the distance. So it isn't that the person is like staring at their shoulder, but it's almost like they're feeling the embrace. And so it's like, okay, that works a little bit better. Okay. But it truly was, again, just needing to unlearn everything you think you know about cinematography and image making and kind of embracing just this other type of logic.
yeah. I was the second unit DP on this Bruce Willis film, like the last one he did. And there's a scene because it's second unit, so we're just doing all these pickups. And we're in an ambulance. It's a U-Haul,
Mhm.
but we're in an ambulance, and I'm in the driver's seat, and this guy's leaning out the passenger side window with a gun, and he's like shooting at a helicopter, and then he gets got right. So
Mhm.
in the movie, in the main unit, he gets pulled back into the car, and I'm sitting there with the camera, and I just look over at the director. I'm like, "Do you want me to grab him?" And he goes, "Yeah, actually." So I was like, "Okay." So he gets shot, and then I just reach out and grab him from behind the camera, and it doesn't look terrible.
Mm.
But I have a tattoo that the actor didn't, and also I was wearing my COVID safe, like wristband.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like and it's like it does because we're shooting anamorphic. Like it didn't look like it was a first person view. You know, it kind of did
Hmm.
look, but even so, like when that came up in the movie, I was like, do I get a credit?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say that's a great hand acting, you
Yeah,
know? A
yeah,
hand actor is rare and hard to find.
you know,
But like those things are just funny things of the process that things that on paper shouldn't really work sometimes do. And things on paper that really should work for whatever reason on the day kind of don't. And I think that was, since we were doing all wonders for this, it was like, Callie Riley, the first AC, who was without a doubt truly one of the best. I think one of the best in the world, genuinely. And she had a laminated printout of every single scene of the movie, and next to it, what camera apparatus was tied. Because since it was Wonders, whatever the camera system was, or whatever modular configuration, it needed to be able to last the entire scene. And so because of that, it was just always kind of this game of we would have, yeah, this is the thing we tested, we kind of build, in some cases, kind of custom built for the actors or for the scene or for the moment. And then, we would put it on and like have the actual actor on that day with this setup, with this costume, and put it all together and be like, oh man, there's something about this that doesn't work. It should work. We tested it, it did work, but today it does not really look right. So then it like became everything we kind of always have to have a plan A, plan B, and plan C of just like different apparatuses, different camera tools, different configurations that we could quickly, we had a B team and their job was basically to have the camera in a different modular configuration so like we could quickly kind of slide into if we needed a different kind of build for the camera. Because again, it was just like you could test and meticulously get ready for it, but again, because of that uncanny effect, it sometimes it didn't work. You just need to figure something out on the day.
well, and one thing I wanted actually, I guess we'll rapid fire. Did you just use one focal length for both, or were you like bouncing around?
We used a few. We used
Okay.
I'd say the hero lens would probably be the 40 mil. Second to that was probably 35 mil, and then the third most used probably a 50. But
Mm.
we had, certain scenes where Dan Sasaki had basically made us a 300, a 400, a 500 mil VA prime to do like some
The
really, really
inserts.
long, yeah.
Yeah.
And a few macro lenses as well. So yeah, it was a mix of things, but kind of, that kind of normal space is usually where we landed for a lot of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. But one thing that I was like, there's no way, but I should ask, did each character have their own style of POV?
I think that they did, but I don't think it was necessarily a conscious thing that Ravel and I were like, okay, so for Turner, this is X, Y, Z. But it was a situation where kind of what we would do is we had this meticulous shot list, but we never gave the actors marks. And again, we encouraged them to kind of like feel the reality of this, like because of this other aspect of artifice, truly feel able to kind of do whatever feels real for you. So, rehearsal became a big thing for us.
Mhm.
And so it was kind of Ramel rehearsing with the actors, and usually me or our camera operator, Sam Ellison, both of us kind of watching the rehearsal, seeing kind of what was happening and kind of studying Brandon and Ethan, the actors who played Elwood and Turner, and just seeing like, how do they move their bodies through the space? Where do they make eye contact? Where do their eyes drift? How are they connecting? And then, of course, it was us kind of interpreting those things in our own body and our own emotions and how we might interact with those things. But it was, it was really in watching their performances that I think, really helped us kind of think about what we wanted to do operation wise at any given moment. So then it was, how Ethan and Brandon just naturally played their characters so differently. Like, Elwood is just such a wide eyed optimist. And I think he sees beauty in his world, even in moments of deep inhumanity. He's drawn to these aesthetically beautiful things in his life and his surroundings. And I think Turner's just naturally more of a realist or more cynical. And that kind of also determines when he makes eye contact with people, when he doesn't make eye contact with people. So, there's a way in which I don't think it was like this is how they do this, and like
His
we
head
only use
bobbles
this
more or
lens on
whatever.
this. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it wasn't necessarily like I think something that was so literalized, but it was something that I think we would always be taking cues on Ramel's direction of the performance and also what the actors were bringing to both of those characters that felt so specific and so unique and so different. And I think that
More
yeah,
about
so it
gaze management.
yeah, exactly. So I think
Yeah.
it's more, there was more cross-pollination between kind of the actors. And again, which is as you're saying, where it's like, I think as image makers, we were invited to have more of a connection to performance and performing ourselves. And also the vice versa of like when we would do body rigs, or in the case of all the images of Elwood as an adult that we shot on Storycam, that was also the actors then kind of controlling the image a lot more because it was just physically attached to their body, and like talking with David Diggs, who plays adult Elwood, of like, okay, let's look at the image. And he's like, all right, he's like, at the beginning of the scene, I feel disconnected. And it's like, okay, then maybe it's about closing down the right side of your shoulder because it cheats them out of the frame. And then when you're feeling more connection, maybe you open up the right side of your shoulder and that brings them into the composition. You're like, yeah, I like that. And so it's like kind of empowering them to make decisions from a place of the emotionality of the moment that then have, compositional consequences that we wanted and we liked. And yeah.
Well, and another thing that I appreciated, somewhat related, is that you guys didn't go for what could easily be a sort of vintage look. It's a very modern, clean look. And I have my guesses as to why that was the choice, but I'd love to hear the correct answer.
Oh, no correct answers, just interpretations. But I think that for me, in thinking about that choice, it is that, as you know, Nickel Boys is based off of real events from the Dozier School of Boys, in which that school was closed down in 2011 and bodies started being exhumed in 2013. So there's a way in which all the things that happen in Nickel Boys are not in our far past. They quite literally were in full operation 10 years ago. So I think that, that was a big thing for our production designer, Nora Mendes, as well, doing research. It's like, because of the Dozier School documents, like we had a lot of pictures of the actual White House, of a lot of these actual places. And in the movie, a lot of the archival is from the real forensics that were found at the Dozier School. And but along with those things, Norm Mendes, our production designer, was also pulling images from Rikers today and like different institutions that are in operation today that have a similar tenor to them. So I think that for us, it was never about making this image anachronistic, as if these events and these of things and these dynamics aren't still in operation
Right.
today, again, which kind of goes back to why I think Ramel really was interested in this first person perspective fundamentally, was that I think that sometimes with, let's call, traditional third person cinema, there's a way in which you're just naturally disconnected from the image as the audience member. Like there's a slight
Voyeuristic.
membrane between there. Yeah, exactly. Like you are in a theater watching, which goes back to the history of film and its connection to theater. So it is literally your position, like the 180-degree rule and proscenium kind of thoughts are around this position of you are sitting back as audience watching a play take place in front of you. There is a natural physical disconnection there. And I'm not saying that movies aren't highly, empathic tools. I think they absolutely are. And I think for Ramel, it was really about, in traditional third person cinema, there's still that deep emotional connection, but there's still a kind of a removal. So for him, it was about just trying to puncture that membrane a little bit between us as viewer and image as story, which it's not tear it down, but it's just to puncture it with the hope that that small incision point would just create more immersion and invite the audience to not look at, say, a close up of like, oh, how is Elwood feeling? Let me look at his face and kind of gauge how he's feeling. Without that information, we kind of do feel a bit unmoored watching the movie. And ideally, what that feeling does is, okay, well, since I can't see exactly what Elwood's feeling, what would I feel if this happened to me? And I think that that's kind of just a different question. And I think it's super related to the fundamental questions of cinema. It's just trying to attack the question almost just 2 degrees off axis to ideally try to just like create a different thought process in your head. Because I think for me, sometimes when I see cinema with some of these like deeply barbaric, inhumane images, sometimes it can kind of just be spectacle where it's just like, whoa, that's crazy that that happened.
Yeah.
Opposed to, I think for Nickel Boys, the idea isn't to try to conjure it's crazy that it happened, but to make it to almost bring it into your body a little bit more and have a more intimate connection with the experience of the things that you're seeing. So I think that that was a large part around the aesthetic, not necessarily trying to shield you as the viewer from just the realities of this still being very present in all of our worlds.
Yeah. Well, and it invites the audience to kind of learn how to be an actor in a sense, internalize the uh, script, as it were. But the thing, and I also appreciated how you would intercut footage of like the space race and stuff. Because I think, especially in America, it's far too easy to see a film like this or even a documentary about, that era and think, well, that's the past. That's the racism is over or whatever.
Mhm,
And to juxtapose those with like the space race or, a marathon full of white people, uh,
mhm.
reminds you, oh, these are two things happening at the same time. This is
Totally,
not like, and also
totally.
showing modern day, let's say Elwood,
Mhm,
just to remind this guy's still alive.
mhm.
Like he's not he didn't
Totally.
fight in World War II.
Totally. It isn't our great great grandparent. Quite
Yeah.
literally, it is. There are people who are alive today who were at the Dojo School. There are people who are at the Dojo School who are in their mid 20s. Like, this is a present tense thing. And I think that that connection also with a lot of the archival around the space race is exactly that, where it's like, ideally, it's about inviting the audience member to think about, man, that almost must have felt crazy. Like kind of like insane to be a young boy and to be watching on TV that mankind is figuring out a way to land on the moon, to walk in outer space, to put ships past our stratosphere for new worlds, new spaces, new cosmoses. And yet I walk out of my house and I can't walk on the same sidewalk as a white couple. Like, just kind of like the strangeness of that. And I'm sure that they didn't perceive it that way, exactly like that, but just to put
You
into
feel
our
it.
bodies, yeah, the strangeness of that, where it's like, I think that that's something that often happens, where I think we often like to think that technological advancement is always tied hand in hand with ethical advancement, and that isn't always true. And I think that the feeling of experiencing that, I could imagine being very surreal sometimes. So I think that that's also why some of that footage is there to, again, try to wrap one's own mind around as a modern viewer, but even as a person at that time, just like, yeah, how does the human mind hold both of those two things in it at the same time? Which I think ultimately is one of our greatest abilities as humans, is to reconcile the irreconcilable. And I think that those pieces of the movie are almost like invitations for us to kind of sit with and think about them. But like everything in Nickel Boys, I think that every piece of meaning has like five other kind of like equally valid interpretations. I think for Rebel, it was almost making every image almost feel like a tarot card, where yes, the Knight of Cups has a set of meanings to it, but what the Knight of Cups might mean for you, who just got out of a breakup, and what the Knight of Cups might mean for me, who just had a baby, are two different things. And yet that card can hold us projecting onto it our stories. I think that how Nicholas Mansour, the editor, and Ramel built the edit is, I think the movie has a very interesting, almost reflective quality to it, that it isn't about what the right interpretation is as much as it's a movie that kind of welcomes the projection of a lot of interpretations, because that's part of the POV thing. If we're inviting the audience into their bodies, which also means inviting the audience with all of their memories, their feelings, to kind of latch on to Elwoods and almost build out a nervous system on the body that we might have put in front of it.
Yeah. Well, and it's so again, I was pretty sleepy yesterday, but I remember right when it ended going like because to be honest, my favorite films were like, The Matrix and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory and Men in Black and shit. So I'm very much, I like a spectacle. And at the end, the movie ends, you guys all come out, and Ramel starts talking, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm too dumb for this movie. Like he
No
immediately came
way.
out and was talking high level concepts, and I went, yeah, I'm, because he was like, I hope people watch this twice, and I was like, I'm fucking definitely gonna have to, because even on first glance, I was like, I get it. I don't think I got it.
But I think that that is, it's one of those things where a lot of our ideas were really conceptual about it, but genuinely it is kind of a movie that I that's also one of the funny things with the point of view is I think that the more you watch it and let go of trying to understand it and
Mm.
actually just let it wash over you, and then the experience you have after it washes over you is the correct answer. Like that is what you are supposed to feel like. It is by design dense so that a person can like kind of latch on any kind of meaning feeling to it. I think is the thing that makes the movie particularly special because honestly it's like a lot of the movies that I loved and what made me want to get into cinema are like honestly a lot of the same movies that you just mentioned. And it's like one of those funny things to me that when you think about it, Jaws is actually pretty avant-garde in form. In story, it might be traditional, but like, the Zolly on the beach for the blood on the beach scene, like that wasn't normal.
Right.
But again, it's a shot that pulls you into the emotions of the depth of his fear, of his world feeling like it's collapsing in on itself, of thinking that there might be a shark in the water at that moment. So, like, to me, it's always been cinema has an incredible ability to pull you in, to pull you past intellectual thought into just emotional transference. And I think that at the heart of the project, even though I think Romello and I might be very highfalutin in our speech, I think is fundamentally actually what we were after. Like, I don't think we wanted to create an academic document, but more to kind of induce a similar feeling that I got watching The Blood on the Beach from Jaws, where it's like, oh my, like, or watching In the Mood for Love by Juan Carwilo. It's like, I just feel an emotion incepted into my body. Um, and I think that Nickel Boys actually works in a similar way that it isn't about deciphering it, even though it looks like it is something that is begging for deciphering. But actually, I think it's just something that is like, meant to kind of watch her because I feel like me, I've seen it countless times when
Right.
in the color, kind of in the dailies, in the edit, in the multiple edits. I've seen it so many times, and yet every single time I feel like I see like, whoa, I didn't know that this and this scene kind of rhymes with this other moment. That's really cool. I just never heard it that way. And this time that I'm watching the movie, like, I like to think about Nickel Boys. This is, a little bit of maybe a nerdy comparison, but I like to think about Nickel Boys as it's really similar to the cave in Empire Strikes Back. When
Mm.
Luke is going to walk into it
Yeah.
and is putting his gun on, and Yoda's like, "You don't need weapons," and Luke's like, "Yeah, okay," and he clicks it on, and Yoda essentially says, "What you'll find in there is what you take in with you."
Yeah.
And I think Nickel Boys has a similar quality to it,
It's a great
where
analogy.
it's hey, I've had a little bit of time to think about it because I'm like, why does this movie keep changing each time I watch it? It's the same movie, and I was one of the people at the table talking about its design. But I think it's because what Ramel is so brilliant at creating in this movie and what Nick, our editor, did is I think that they truly created a reflective document where it is like the cave. What you see is what you take in with you. So to me, the experience is actually to just go into the cave and let it mirror you. And you're going to see something really interesting, both about its world, but also about yourself. And like, that's why I think it is, I think, a really incredible film in that way. And one that, even though I know how all the things were done in the movie, I still feel like I get kind of pulled away and walk away with something different each time I interact with it, kind of precisely because of that reason.
Yeah. Well, and I think it makes me think, you know what the complete polar opposite side of the coin is, now that you
Mm,
mentioned that, is Tenet.
hmm
Because
I get that.
I realized after watching that film like twice, oh, you're just supposed to go on the roller coaster ride. You're not
Yes,
supposed to analyze this. This is
100%.
purely for fun. This is not a document to be dissected.
100%,
Yeah.
100%. Like that was actually when I first saw it. I was my wife and I saw it, and she was just like, "I don't understand." Da da da. And I was like, "Yeah, but it was cool." And she was like, "What do you mean? That's like nada." And I was like, I don't think you're supposed to like pause it and be like, "Well, wait, how does entropy work?" Like,
Right.
actually, I think that it's like just believe it, like go on the ride. And I think that the ride is exciting and
It's
interesting
fun.
if you surrender yourself to it. But if you keep trying to experience it on your own terms, you're gonna have a hard time.
There is no what is
But
the
I
Matrix with
exactly,
Tenet.
exactly. And I think that that's so Nickel Boys, I think, has a similar thing of like, I don't think it's trying to decipher it as a document. I think it's actually it is a ride. So like it's actually that's why I think also like, I usually hate when people say this of like, oh yeah, the movie gets better on the second viewing. It's like, why wasn't the movie good on the first viewing? But I will say that there is something about Nickel Boys of that, it almost teaches you how to watch itself. And then almost when you know that, when you go back in another time, there's just it almost is like another movie completely because you're just seeing different things and other things are connecting up in different ways that it is just an experience.
Well,
Um,
I think
yeah.
that when people say like, "Oh, it was better the second time," if I'm being charitable, is a lot of time. I think people by nature love to learn,
Mm,
and with a film like Nickel Boys, the first time you watch it, you're learning. Maybe you've never heard of this situation or whatever. You're learning due to the experience. The second time, if you go back in, you're learning for a new reason, but you're still learning. A lot
yeah,
of times, if you watch a movie the second time, it can let you down because you've already seen it and it's
totally.
not, and then it falls. But when you make a film that begs a second one, this is also why you said that you and Ramel speak highfalutinly, but I actually would rather that be the case than someone be a tryhard about trying to make a film like this. Like you guys intellectualized it in a way that makes it worth watching again because there
Mm,
is not only some form of education, but not in an academic sense, in an
totally.
emotional sense. Something we've said a million times on this podcast is that emotionally correct tends to supersede technically correct. And making a
Definitely.
technically correct document about the school or the camp or whatever the fuck you want, the prison, uh,
Mhm.
is one thing, but I don't think
Mm,
it would be as um, it wouldn't hit the same way. It wouldn't be. I wouldn't suggest necessarily you got to go see this. It'd be like,
totally.
oh, I saw this really interesting documentary.
Totally.
But you need that need isn't there in the way that
Totally.
Nickel Boys I think invites a need to see it.
Oh, I love that. No, I totally agree. And even in like, an adaptation sense with that too, where it's like, I think that the book is fantastic, and it almost feels like the movie is a supplemental piece to it, where it is truly Ramel making a separate form of art that
It's the
speaks
VR
to
version of the book.
exactly, exactly, truly, truly, where it's
Yeah.
like, but same with like 2001, where it's like Arthur C. Clarke's book is fantastic, but like the movie 2001 is fascinating because it's Kubrick's interpretation of the things that kept him up at night about the book. And like Kubrick trying to wrap his mind around mortality and the monolith and all of these ideas that like are present in the book. But like I think that kind of creating a supplemental other form of an art is so fun, which I think that Ramel and Jocelyn really accomplished with this is an adaptation where it holds that a similar quality that I really love, which is what you're speaking to. Is like it actually creates almost another form of learning, another form of interaction with these ideas and these concepts. So, like if you read the book, I think that you'll still see something fundamentally that you could not close your eyes and imagine. Oh, this is how it would be adapted. And the same with like watching the movie, reading the books. Like, oh, this is like not necessarily a. The movie wasn't a step by step all the things that happened, even though they might share a lot of the same plot moments how they're being shown and articulated again is exactly what you're saying is this emotional journey I
Yeah.
think was at the core of every conversation Ramel and I had was again what's the emotional arc and the story of this piece and how can we actually release ourselves from thinking it needs to be um, just narrative that conveys that idea and like how can we actually create an emotional arc for the viewer watching it.
Yeah. Well, and there's certain people, again, they'll see something like that and go, but that's the past. It's like the way with every artistic choice made, the POV, the not making it all vintagey, the having everything be wonders. It's either your words invite, my words forces the audience to live in that moment and internalize it in a way that many other art forms, VR might be the closest one, but I think VR also uh, would be a little too choose your own adventure about it because you can do this,
Mhm.
and I still think
Totally.
that forcing the gaze into certain areas, like when they get pulled over, he says,
Mm.
"Don't look," and he looks at the ground and then immediately looks over. Like that's in my chair, I was like, "No, no, look!" Like,
Yeah.
like
Yeah, totally.
it be having that was all very just really well done, man. Um,
Mm. Thank you so much.
we got a little over, so I'll let you go here. But I did want to I did want to ask about the Rage Against the Machine video. Well, I guess we'll have to
Oh
talk
yeah.
about that later.
Yeah. Hey, always down for it.
I d- my favorite band growing up, and I mean, still to this
Totally.
day, top five for sure. But just when I saw that on your website, I was like, oh fuck yeah, like
Yeah. Surely a dream project.
yeah. But you mentioned earlier a diversity of lighting and the mixing hard and soft and stuff like that, and that's something that I personally have been wanting to dive more into because I one of the best piece of advice that I got that I never really followed was from it was like Annie Leibovitz's gaffer or something like that.
Mm.
And they were like, "Oh yeah, it's usually like a big, maybe it wasn't Annie, it was I can't remember, but it was someone like that, And they're like, "Yeah,
Mm.
we would use big umbrellas and then we'd put a hard spot in the middle, like a bare flash in the middle, so you
Mm.
get the big soft with this other kick."
Yeah.
And I know you guys use the CRLS systems or some
Yes.
custom like flexi mirrors, but I was wondering if you could kind of walk me through the mechanics of blending that, like, because every shot looks so natural.
Mm.
How are you able to achieve that?
Yeah, no, I always think about it and like the people who like really got my mind going on it were Nestor Almendros's work and like Days of Heaven, but even how Nestor Almendros in his memoirs kind of talks about using mirrors is 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 that feeling of the complexity to the quality of light. And I think that that's, then I'm also thinking about Harris Savides and like I think Harris had a brilliance in not only the diversity of light quality, but also texture. Like I'm always thinking about like it's almost like the concept of contrast. I feel like when people hear and think about contrast, they think primarily the juxtaposition between light and darkness. But actually, I think contrast is much larger concept in that it is the juxtaposition of one thing to another that allows you to see in starker relief the entire image. And I think about that in terms of lighting as well, where it's like, so there's a diversity in quality. So there's hard and there's soft sitting together, a diversity in texture. So there are, maybe mohair next to chrome, and then a diversity of exposure where, like Ansel Adams and the zone system, just in theory, it's like getting that dark, dark, dark with that white, 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 and like trying to create the gradation between those things, I think, are just how I've always seen the world. Whenever I look around the room, if I look around my hotel room right now, it's like the sun is coming in and hitting the wall, but then it's falling off, but then it's skipping off the ground, and then it's lighting up the back of the hotel room. And like, there's something about that that always has felt cinematic to me. I think it's also that it feels three-dimensional, and I think that that's kind of that's the trick that we try to play is we take a three-dimensional world and we compress it into a two-dimensional image. But it's still making that two-dimensional image feel like there's volume, feel like there's space, feels like there's reality. So towards kind of like getting those hits, it was yeah, mirrors are a really big thing for me. Where I'll either take the sun and have a full mirror, a four by mirror, and then we'll bounce it into a lot of other mirrors and send those things back. Or I'll use like an 18K or a light, and I'll basically surround the light with different mirrors of different qualities and kind of reflective qualities and send that back into the space, so that you do have, and that's why I love the light bridge system is like you can get a hard hit, but you can also use like, a number four and have a really soft kind of spread return is, yeah, there's something about that that's always felt really just realistic to me. And at our key grip, Gary Kelso kind of knew how much I loved mirrors. So we had multiple light bridge systems. And then he and his rigging grip, Moses Mott, they built me a bunch of custom mirrors. So like they basically built me a 4x4 kind of like bendable broken mirror so it could create, we could push something into it and create textures on the walls.
Like
We
a
used the
flat disco
dado.
ball.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And we basically use the E-Flex system, which is essentially a flat disco ball too, for like smaller versions of that. And so, yeah, it was really about, yeah, using mirrors and trying to find kind of textured lighting where even if it wasn't a mirror, if it's like some, gold or checkered lame on the floor and then shooting something into it. So it just activates that as like kind of a low light. Yeah, I feel like the thing I'm always into is just trying to create texture into the light because there's something that feels really, I don't know, like I think that when I think about memory, I remember that stuff from my childhood. Weirdly, I remember some of the qualities and the textures, and very rarely is it ever one thing. It's never really always hard. It's never really always soft. It's never really half soft, half hard. Like it's kind of a mix in there, and it's, yeah, just finding ways to recreate that. I remember one time on set when Rebel walked in, who Rebel is a visual artist and a photographer and an incredible photographer in his own right. And shoots primarily large format photographs. And we walked into a space and like, there was wind blowing and kind of this like kind of weird shape of light pushing through trees from outside is playing against the wall. And it's like, oh my God, this is beautiful. This is like we came at the right time of day to shoot this. And I like smiled and I turned to Bob Bates, our gaffer, and I was like, Bob, tell him to pan away the first mirror. And then we panned it away and the room just fell into darkness and the wind stopped going. And he's like, what happened? And I was like, oh, all of this is all fake. This is all just like mirrors ricocheting a billion things outside into here. And the breeze that's going, it's a fan underneath the windowsill that's pushing up into that. And like, we're shooting a mirror through a cucullus and then some other branches to create that on the wall. Like none of this is real. Which I think was a moment that kind of like he was like, oh my God, like why would he question it again when there was no lights or stands in the room? Like, yeah, this is just that we came to the infirmary around this time of day. Which again also just speaks to our gaffer, Bob Bates's true mastery, and Gary Kelso, our key grip. Like the two of them were just such an incredible, exciting team because I had talked about a lot of these concepts about exposure diversity and kind of exposure like texture diversity and quality diversity. But the two of them together really kind of just pushed that concept and, had teams where they could kind of build us custom designs of things to keep finding ways to find that anew. But yeah, it was just always about finding a way to just like, almost make something slightly imperfect,
Right.
weirdly adds kind of a perfect quality to it.
I can't remember who it was. So you had no lights like in the set ever?
Not often. Like sometimes we might have had light mats with like egg crates, but usually we didn't. Like usually
Gotcha.
it was kind of pushing something in or building it into the set.
Yeah, because well, now I have two thoughts, but one of them was because I was going to ask, like, did you, with all the like reflections and stuff, were you considering how those random reflections would hit the talent and then kind of not have them do that, or were they just, was it just like find the light, it's all gravy?
Yeah, it's find the light. It's all gravy. Like I always prefer to, and it's maybe especially in this piece, to light spaces, not faces. So it really was almost about creating a 360 playground for the actors, for the director, and kind of would just like we would spend a lot of time building that and would just kind of let them free in that space without marks because, I just think I have a certain feeling around light where it's like, it's again something that Nestor Almendros kind of would talk about a lot, where it's just like my lighting is actually the architecture of a space. Like feel a space, look at a space, see how it was designed, where it's like, okay, the living room has south-facing windows because it's expecting the family to be in the living room for most of the day. The kitchen has west-facing windows because it's assuming you're cooking your largest meal at dinner around, around evening time. And it's like, okay, the bedroom is east-facing because you're waking up to the sun. And it's like choosing your location, choosing your space to kind of do the lighting for you because light is tied to human activity and how humans move through space. And like, especially in places like castles before there was electrical systems, like they just had to build castles in ways that human activity was moving at the same time that the light was naturally moving through the space. And I think that I try to think about that philosophy in all of my lighting as well, of thinking about if you create natural flows of light in space, humans usually interact with that in only one way. Like, it's one of those things where it's like, I've never seen a person walk to a dark corner of a room and start crying.
Right.
Like they might sit down on their couch and there's a lamp naturally on the side of the couch because humans sit at the edge of couches and they read and they interact and they talk. So then all of a sudden, if you just put light in places that humans naturally interact and the actors don't have marks, they will naturally, their human behavior will naturally take them to those places. And if it takes them away from those places and the person goes to the dark part of their living room and starts crying, that's also fascinating. That also
Right.
says something deeply cinematic and visual. So to me, it's always like kind of a win-win where it's like setting up the space in a way that honors a real flow of what light is and how light interacts with our human lives, and then letting actors free into that space. They're always going to find beautiful light for you. They're always going to naturally find themselves on the shadow side. There's almost a way where it's like setting up a situation, they'll find the frame for you and they'll find the good lighting if you build the lighting in ways that are natural to how we move. So Nickel Boys is really just taking that idea and expanding it to thinking about all of these spaces as three-dimensional and 360. And so then how do we build things into the space without giving them marks, but they will naturally want to have certain interactions with the space, which will then kind of help our lighting each time it does.
Yeah. Yeah, the that made me think of two things. One, when you're saying like when there's just errant light and stuff, it feels more real. I can't remember who it was, but I was interviewing someone and they described it as the fuck it light. So they'd set
Mm.
up all the nice lights and then they would just go, "All right, put a fuck it light over there," which was just like a weird slash that had hit a couch in a way that you would never do intentionally.
Oh,
And they're like, that just unlocks the like, oh, this is all supposed to be. If that thing's screwed up, then this all must be real.
yeah,
You
totally.
know?
Totally.
And
No.
that scene in the in Fray where he does look gorgeous.
Oh, thank you so much. But no,
Um,
I think that was essentially it, is trying to observe real life and then bring those aspects into a cinematic space, setting traps for interesting things to happen.
yeah. And the other thing I thought of was when you're talking about like the design of houses or castles or whatever, there's actually and the way that like humans naturally interact with them, actually baseball stadiums, the rules are you're
Mm,
supposed to have home plate or third base, whatever, face, I think it's northeast. Like
mm.
legally that's what's supposed to happen. And there's only like two baseball stadiums that follow that, the Coliseum and Dodger Stadium.
Oh, wow.
Might be another. The rest of them are all goofed up, but like
Yeah,
the rule book does say it's because of the sun
of
that
course.
the stadium is supposed to face a very specific direction.
No,
And I
that
just learned that the other
makes
day, so that's
sense.
the only reason why I
No,
thought of
that
it.
that makes sense. There's so many interactions with that I don't think we realize how much of just naturally a lot of kind of human design is based on these sources that we couldn't control and we still can't control. And I feel like it's, most of the time it's actually about just like looking at those things and like, we were talking about it earlier, where I think that filmmaking is actually an art of subtraction a lot more than it's an art of addition.
Hmm.
So I think it's actually about taking things out so that you can see the core vectors. And then it's about like, okay, actually just moving this thing 2 degrees and like it seems interesting than it is about, adding on to everything that's happening. It's like I think that or at least I think that that's how I tried to get to um kind of a more honest feeling light for this project.
Yeah, it's about layers, but only a couple layers, not
Exactly.
every layer.
Not all of the layers,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, yeah, I've kept you a little over, but I would love to have you back on to keep chatting because I know we could
Yes,
talk about a lot more.
I would love to.
Yeah. Do you? Are you not in LA, right? You're in a hotel right now.
No, yeah, I'm in a hotel in LA. I'm
Yeah.
normally in New York.
Gotcha. All right. Well, how long? I'll cut all this out. How long are you here for?
I leave in like 2 days.
Oh, okay.
And then I think that going to San Francisco, then going back to LA, then going
Oh,
to
it's
New York, then
following the
going back
film.
to LA, then going, yeah, yeah,
Gotcha.
exactly.
Well, next
Yeah,
time
yeah.
you're in LA, let me know and I'll let you. We can hook these up on.
Yeah,
I got a
would
C500
absolutely.
that you can
Oh my God.
give
Would
it a check on.
absolutely love that. Would
Cool.
absolutely love that. I'm deeply curious about them. Tell me what
Yeah,
you think.
yeah. Well, so they sent me these. They're like, for I write for Pro Video Coalition, so they're like, we'd
Hmm.
love a review, blah blah blah. And then I was being lazy about it because I didn't have anything to shoot. And, you know, I liked it. And then they sent me an email. They're like, actually, we're holding off on releasing those. So no one actually knows about these yet.
Oh, interesting.
These are
Okay,
the
even
full frame
better.
versions because they've released the
Oh,
Super
sick.
35.
Yeah, yeah,
So these
yeah.
are the full frame
Whoa,
ones.
they are so small.
Yeah, I mean,
That's insane.
so there's
Oh my God. What an exciting time.
a 30, 32, a 42, 55 and an 85 right now. And then I think they might come up with another one. But
That's wild.
I will say the only thing about them going, this makes me think that they just added one element, like a physical glass element to the Super 35 model,
Makes
is
sense.
on full frame, it pin cushions.
Oh,
Not
interesting.
aggressively, but it is noticeable on the edges. And
Yeah,
in Resolve, it's pretty easy to just pull it. It's not a very aggressive
yeah,
change, but
yeah,
you can see it. And if you hate pin cushion, I would much prefer a
yeah,
barrel
yeah, totally.
cushions, but
Distortion. Yeah,
it's an easy fix in Resolve. And if you don't have a straight edge there, you can't really tell anyway.
yeah.
But
That
yeah,
is
next time you're in town.
wild. I would absolutely love that. They genuinely, again, having lenses that are cheap enough that you could kind of fuck around with them or have someone get in there and like, you know, create gaps with the elements or something is like interesting to me.
Yeah. Or in my
We're in a
case,
good
just
time.
working on lower budget shit.
I mean, but hey, I think Super Speed Mark II's some of the best lenses ever of all time. And despite people complaining about the Jag and Bokeh and like them being the easiest to rent, I still think they're some of the all-time or standard speed, some of the all-time greats.
Yeah, and you know, my friend Matthew Duclos, who
Hmm.
you know, Duclos lenses,
Of course.
he said a million times that it's not like if you so many things can just be changed by changing out the iris for a rounded iris, not even
Totally.
eight leaves, 12 leaves, whatever,
Totally.
but just a rounded iris. So if you have like which lenses have like the three iris, but whatever, where you get those
Hmm.
triangle bokehs,
Yeah, yes.
just
Mark II.
round them out. Yeah, yeah, just round them
Yeah.
out, and then boom,
They're
you don't even
great.
have to do
Yeah.
any mods or anything. Just switch out the
Oh,
iris.
100%. 100%. The glass is great.
Yep, yep. All right,
It's a
well,
good time in that sense.
it is. I'm gonna let you go,
Okay.
but yeah, please stay in
Awesome.
touch.
Kenny, thank
Yeah,
you so much. Please do.
later, buddy. Frame and Reference is an Albot production, produced and edited by me, Kenny McMillan. If you'd like to support the podcast directly, you can do so by going to frameandrefpod.com and clicking on the Patreon button. It's always appreciated, and as always, thanks for listening.